Hi and welcome back to a new video. Today AMD released the 9600X and the 9700X. We were happy to get a 9700X 8-core CPU, which we will talk about in today's video. I decided not to include any kind of Intel CPUs in my today's testing simply because Intel is currently working on the microcode update to fix their issues, which might result in a performance impact. And that means if Intel releases this in like a week or two, that means that in a week or two, those benchmark results would not be correct anymore, and the Intel CPUs in reality might perform worse than they are doing now, which I think would be unfair. That's why I decided not to use any kind of Intel CPUs in today's video. Are you looking for a convincing cloud provider? Then Hetzner is the right place for you. As a leading hosting provider with their own high-tech data centers, they offer GDPR-compliant hosting at incredibly low prices. I often told you about Hetzner operating several 100,000 servers at multiple locations in Europe and the US, and now they extended to a new location in Singapore. Hetzner cloud servers are not only multi-award winning, but also user-friendly, immediately available and flexibly scalable. Click on the link below and check out Hetzner right now. All the benchmarks were done on the same platform, same motherboard with exactly the same settings. So latest BIOS that was provided also by AMD. I'm running X670E Hero motherboard from ASUS. That's the latest Windows, latest chipset driver, latest driver from NVIDIA. So everything latest update and also running exactly on the same platform for all the CPUs, which are 7600X, 7700X, 7800X 3D and the new 9700X. All the testing was done with a dual 16GB 6000 C30. Generally speaking, the 9700X also has increased memory performance. It increased from 5200 to officially 5600, so that's a good step. Officially higher bandwidth, higher memory speed possible. What I find a bit weird and questionable is that in the official launch briefing requests that we received for testing the CPU, they asked us to test with 6000, while officially it's only 5600 supported. That's a little bit odd. Doesn't really matter for me because we didn't do any kind of comparison against Intel CPUs, but AMD, if you request higher memory speed, might also make sense that you officially support it on the CPU with warranty. To get a first impression of the CPU, we just look at my system, so the 9700X, that it's made in 4nm technology, so it's smaller than the previous 7700X, so that's the major change on this CPU. As I said before, Crosshair X670E Hero motherboard with the provided 2201 BIOS version. We will just start into Cinebench. Keep in mind though, opening CPU-Z and hardware info at the same time will neglect a little bit of performance, like maybe 5%, but it's fine to just get an impression. And what I find interesting, first look, is the temperature. That is what AMD also stated previously before launching the CPU. They changed something about the CPU, so they made the thermal transfer more efficient and they also changed the sensor placement itself. So the temperature is not comparable to the previous 7700X, but it's still in generally lower than before. We see less than 60 degrees Celsius under load, while the CPU clocks at about 4.4 to 4.5 gigahertz under load in R23, and we see a CPU power draw just drop down but peak below 90 watt, ending in about 18,500 points, but as I said before, we lose a bit due to hardware info and CPU-Z. If we perform 5 Cinebench runs and take the average out of the results, we can't really see a difference between the 7700X and the 9700X. It went from 19,400 points to 19,500 points, which is a plus of 0.3%, but it's not really worth mentioning. What is definitely worth mentioning though is the decrease in power consumption by 40%. It dropped from 145 watt to 88 watt on average. As usual, in all of my charts, in yellow you can see the performance number. That could be the average FPS or the points like in Cinebench. In blue you can see the average power consumption, so not the peak but the average. For example, if I'm doing a gaming test and it takes 5 minutes, you can see the average power consumption across those 5 minutes, which is the realistic value that you will have at home while gaming, for example. And if it's also a gaming chart, then you will see in brown the 1% low FPS. So back to the Cinebench chart, again, the 9700X and 7700X are performing about the same, and as usual, the 7800X 3D is not really that strong in this type of calculation and is about 7% slower. Continuing with HWBot X265 benchmark, which is essentially H.265 video encoding as just having a second production benchmark in our chart. Very similar as with Cinebench, the 7700X and 9700X are performing about the same, while the 9700X is much more efficient and consumes about 26% less power than the 7700X. Again, in this scenario, the X3D CPU is not that strong. Continuing with gaming benchmarks performed with the RTX 4090 in lower resolutions than what you would usually use, but this is pushing the system more towards the CPU bottleneck. We're starting with Remnant 2, and here it's also as expected. 7800X 3D is still a very strong CPU. If we focus on the 1% low FPS, all three 7800X 3D, 7700X and 9700X are performing about the same. There is not really a big difference. Only on the average FPS, the X3D is about 18% faster. But if we just compare 7700X and 9700X, there's not really a big difference, neither in performance nor in the power consumption. In the quite recent Assassin's Creed Mirage, the 9700X consumes about 9 watt less than the 7700X while being about 2% faster. The performance difference to the X3D is still at 16% on average. And also the X3D consumes about 20 watt less under load. In Cyberpunk 2077 it was a little bit odd for me because the 9700X was slightly slower than the 7700X. That was quite odd. I was first like, maybe something is wrong, but then I repeated the testing 5 times, and I'm not using the in-game benchmark. I'm using my own in-game scene, which takes 5 minutes, so it's, at least in my opinion, more accurate because it's just a longer time. And I used this 5 times. So I'm talking about 25 minutes of in-game scene, compared it, did it 5 times, and it was still the same. So the 9700X on average was still a bit slower. Then I talked to some other tech media, and they basically confirmed that the CPUs are very close to each other, and depending on maybe your sample, maybe my 7700X is a little bit stronger and my 9700X boosts maybe 25 megahertz less, then it might just be this result. So in result, I had about 2 FPS lower in the 1% low, but at the same time also about 20 watt less under load. Still, the 7800X 3D is dominating. Continuing with high FPS shooters, CS2 and Valorant, and I ran those with a slightly higher resolution, so 1440p and 4K, because even in that scenario with the 4090, I was CPU bottlenecked. In Valorant, I was really surprised, and I'm not sure why this is the case. Again, this was tested multiple times. I had a performance increase of 26% over the 7700X, while also consuming less power. Still, it's 19% behind the X3D. On the other hand though, if we switch to Counter-Strike 2, 1440p, I have about the same results as before, so we're talking about a 3 to 4% performance increase over the 7700X, while consuming slightly less power, but it's still far behind the 7800X 3D. After my first testing, I would say that in multi-core performance, both of the CPUs, 7700X, 9700X, perform about the same, while the new CPU, 9700X, consumes about 30 to 40% less power in multi-core, which is definitely interesting when it comes to just the raw efficiency. In gaming though, the difference is pretty small, and I would say far from being significant, especially if you take into account that most of the scenarios are quite CPU bottlenecked. I mean, you wouldn't play all the scenarios with 1080p resolution. And then we saw a performance increase of 3 to 6%, while the power draw dropped by 5 to 10 watts. And that's because the load on the CPU in gaming is simply not as high, which is just resulting in the CPU being roughly the same as the 7700X. So there's also not a big efficiency change, at least in my testing. And if we now take the pricing into account, at least here in Germany, CPU is going to cost 399 euro. That is about 50 euro more than the X3D, and it's over 100 euro more than the 7700X. At least to me, that's not really impressive and probably nothing I would buy compared to the previous CPUs. But just let me know your comments, what you think about it, especially considering or taking it into account with the pricing. At the beginning of the video, I showed you this Cinebench R23 run where you could see very low temperatures and also very low power draw. I think AMD limited the power of the CPU, the power draw, too much, which obviously makes the CPU very efficient, but doesn't really allow any kind of performance gain once the CPU is heavily stressed or is more stressed than usual. So if we go to BIOS and enable the PBO, it's getting quite interesting. So just BIOS PBO, Precision Boost Overdrive, go to this menu, set it to manual, and we will just, brute force unlimited. Obviously, you can spend more time to tweak it to make it even better, but that should be good for demonstration. In Cinebench, this changes things quite drastically. Starting with the power draw, you can straight see it increased from not even 90 watt previously to about 170 watt now, which is much more closer to the 7700X previously. Also, the temperatures are now much closer to what you are used to with the 7700X. Also, look at this. The CPU performance, or the clock, increased from about 4.4 to 4.5 to 5.2 to 5.3 GHz. So just by unlocking PBO, that is causing huge changes to the CPU, and also the performance. Now it's 22,000 points. Look at this chart, and this is now done properly without hardware info and run 5 times again. Of course, the 9700X now pulls 166 watt in this case, but it's also 21% faster as the 9700X in stock condition, and that's just by unlocking PBO. So quite interesting and also impressive how much potential is left in the 9700X if you just unlock the power. Like plus 20%, that's kind of mind-blowing to me. Also, at least to me, raises the question why it was so tight when it comes to the power limit. Of course, it causes the 9700X to be an extremely efficient CPU, but maybe like 10 or 20 watt more would have given it a little bit more performance increase over the 7700X to also justify the additional price a little bit more. Of course, I ran the other benchmarks through the same setting with unlocked PBO, for example here with HWBot X265 video encoding, also plus 18% more performance by unlocking PBO. In most of the games, it doesn't have this kind of impact though, simply because the CPU is not running under such a high load. So it's not getting to the 90 watt mark. You can pause here and switch through the games and inspect it in more detail if you want to. Generally though, we're speaking about 1 to 4 FPS difference, which is not that really worth mentioning. Only in Counter-Strike, for whatever reason, I had a small performance decrease. In Valorant, however, it increased by 7%, which is because the CPU is pulling about 100 watt in this scenario, which is just about 10 watt above the stock condition of this CPU. At least in my opinion, AMD restricted the power a little bit too much for the 9700X. 10 or 20 watt more would have caused the CPU to be generally a little bit faster than the 7700X. It's not a big problem though, because you can just go to BIOS and unlock PBO if you want to. Of course, for the price of paying more for power draw, which as long as you have sufficient cooling is fine. And talking about higher power draw, you can also overclock this CPU, which is amazing. And yeah, it will cause higher power draw. I didn't have too much time to look into overclocking yet. That's something I still want to do for the future video, but there's something I still want to show you right now. It's just a quick and dirty overclock right now, 5.4 GHz across all of the cores, static, and also running R23 single in the background. It just takes forever, but just so you see the performance in that scenario as well. It's currently drawing about 50 watt. Performance-wise, multi is much more impressive. The 2057, not that much for a single-threaded, but with unlocked power and static clock, it's about still 170 watt, but we see a performance of 23,000 points roughly. That was with 5.4 GHz. I then performed the clean runs again 5 times repeated and had 24,300 points, which is about 25% more than stock for the 9700X. That is pretty impressive, especially for an 8-core Ryzen CPU. At this point, I'm just way too limited by the 360 AIO, which is why I will do that in the next video, maybe also with deleting, try to figure out what we can do with the 9700X when it comes to just manual overclocking and push more performance. And that's also for me probably the conclusion of the entire 9700X. It's only a CPU that might make sense if you're willing to do any kind of adjustments, like unlocking PBO and maybe looking to do some overclocking, because in any other scenario, at least from my perspective, if you want to use the CPU for gaming, the 7800X 3D is still the much better option. It consumes even less power, is cheaper, and gives you a lot more performance. And even compared to the 7700X, if you take the price into account, doesn't really make a lot of sense. But for overclocking and modifications, it could definitely be a very interesting CPU, which is what I want to investigate in the next video. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time. Bye bye.